Thank you very much for the introduction. As Ronan mentioned, I'm an associate at Perkins Coie. We have a very large blockchain practice, about 30 or 40 lawyers. It's been really exciting seeing the growth in this space and all of the fascinating projects that people like you in this room are doing. So to kick it off, I know that despite this very broad title, I only have 15 minutes, which is not a lot of time for a lawyer. So I'm going to keep it focused on a more narrow topic, which is sales of so-called utility tokens, which would be broadly defined as a blockchain-based token that's intended to provide access to a product or a service or a use within a protocol or platform that somebody is developing. And for purposes of this short presentation, given the sophistication of this audience, I'm going to assume familiarity with blockchain technology and tokenization in general. So just as a very general overview of where I'd like to proceed, I know securities law is typically and rightfully one of the key considerations for utility tokens, but I'm also going to survey a few other areas that are often overlooked, but should certainly be considered by anybody in this space. And the overarching theme would be to have a clear, well-reasoned regulatory strategy and a viable use case that ideally has a good crypto-economic foundation for why you need that token in your protocol or platform, and then to execute that strategy consistently, not just in your terms or your documents, but across all of your communications. And I'll explain why that's important a bit later. And this won't come as news to many folks in this room, but why this is a timely topic. There has been an explosion of activity in this space in this year alone. I believe over $2 billion in proceeds through blockchain-based token sales. And in general, there's a bit of a blurring of lines between tokenized goods and services and utility on the one hand, and tokenized financial returns and investment-type products on the other. And given this explosion of activity, unsurprisingly, regulators and law enforcement are starting to pay attention, which increases the importance for folks active in the space to pay attention as well. So to jump into securities law issues, again, I'm sure a lot of folks in this room have heard of the infamous Dow report. This was the SEC's first major statement on blockchain tokens. This came out in July, and full discussion is outside the scope of this presentation, but at a very high level, this was a decentralized, autonomous organization that took in Ether from investors and essentially was going to fund projects on a decentralized basis. And the SEC didn't have a lot of trouble concluding that that was still an investment contract. It met all of the classic hallmarks of the so-called Howey test for investment contracts, that there's an investment of money in a common enterprise with expectation of profits through the efforts of others. What was really notable about the Dow report was the efforts of the SEC to really explain why just because you do something through automatable code or smart contracts, it doesn't put you outside the realm of the federal securities laws. And we would expect that principle to apply across other regulatory areas as well. And Howey, I'll discuss in a little more detail, but as a general matter, it's really important to remember that it is a function over form test. In a lot of other jurisdictions other than the US, financial products are a little bit more form-driven, generally speaking. So if you do certain things, you have a better idea whether you do or don't fall within the scope of the regulation. In the Howey test is deliberately crafted to look at what the thing actually does, regardless of what you call it. And so for that reason, it's very difficult to contract around it, and it's very facts and circumstances dependent. And so in our experience doing a number of these token sales through the course of the year, the investment in money and common enterprise prongs are interpreted broadly enough that they're very likely satisfied, which means that if you want to say you are not a security, you need to look at knocking out one of the third or fourth factors, which are whether there were reasonable expectations of profits, and whether those, if there were such profits, whether they derive through the managerial efforts of you or somebody else. And so this is where you would look first. I mean, on the expectation of profits prong, there are a few things that you just would definitely want to avoid. If there are ownership interests, if there are royalties, dividends, payouts, those are very likely going to be viewed as something that has a hallmark of an investment instrument. But it's still possible to still be a security just through capital appreciation. So translating into token language, just by holding the token, will it go up in value through the efforts of somebody else? And so this is where crypto economics comes in. So if you were essentially trying to say that there weren't expectations of profits, what that really means in practice is you need to say that there was a consumptive motive, the desire to use the token, predominated any sort of profit motive. It's okay in general for some profit motive to be there, but the consumptive motive needed to have been predominant. And so in general, the projects that have the strongest use case. And this is something where people, like, through the way that your protocol is being designed, there are inherent incentives for somebody to hold and use that token in connection with the protocol that you are building and deploying. That really helps your case on that point. And so one good thought experiment is this the kind of thing that you could do just with Ether or some other cryptocurrency? Or is it something that you really need this token that you've designed and sold in your platform? And the more that the latter is true, the better you would likely be on this prong. And then, as I mentioned at the outset, a really important aspect under the securities laws are, once you've got your use case, your theory, your crypto economics around what the token does, as to why it is fundamentally focused on utility rather than generating passive returns or investment benefits. That will be in your white paper, and you need to be very disciplined across all your communications. In the securities laws under this test, look at anything that is said about your token. And so if the SEC were to come in, if you were to be in private litigation, it would be relevant. Whatever emails were out there, Slack channels, Reddit AMAs, that could all be relevant. So very important to be disciplined across all of your communications on that theory. And robust and clear terms of sale and disclosures are very important in this regard, because although that expectation of profits is measured from the perspective of the buyer, it's still, if it went to a jury, let's say, it's still a very important fact would be, what sort of things did the seller, how did they try to induce people to buy the token? And the first place in the court or jury would probably look is at the contract, the terms of sale, and what that said. And so it needs to be very, very clear what you get, and more importantly, what you don't get when you buy the token. And as a few thoughts on the efforts of others, if there is an expectation of profit, then the inquiry will turn to that fourth factor, whether those profits are derived from your managerial efforts. And on that front, generally speaking, if the more you have your protocol or platform built out and ready to go, and more utility there actually is when people get their token and use it, the stronger argument you would have that any sort of profit expectation there might have been would not be derived from your managerial efforts. And a few remaining thoughts on the DAO report. Beyond focusing on the fact that the DAO was a unregistered offering of securities, they also looked at other players in the ecosystem and said that if you are a consultant or an advisor, you're an exchange or an investor, or even as someone who buys a bunch of tokens with the intent to resell them, you could also come within the ambit of the federal securities laws as an underwriter, participant, or securities exchange. So it's not just the people who are selling the token who need to be attentive to whether the token is likely to be a security or not. And we just last week had seen the first actual, so I should back up, the DAO report was a report of investigation, and the SEC declined to actually go forward with an enforcement action. But last week were two of the first actual enforcement actions involving token sales. And these, Recoin and DRC, essentially were fraudulent enterprises. And it does make sense in terms of the SEC's focus, although they can bring an enforcement action for even technical unregistered activity. The heart of what we really ratchet up the enforcement concern if there is fraud, if you're not following through on what you said you would do. And so I know securities law issues are front and center for most people in this space, but to touch briefly on some other issues that are often overlooked. Money transmitter law, which applies at the federal and state level in the US, is also relevant in the token sale and in the operation context. Under federal law, the concept of convertible virtual currency is very broad. It encompasses digital units that act as a substitute for real currency or have an equivalent value in real currency. And so it's likely that they would encompass many, say, for example, ERC20 tokens. I mean, there are arguments that it wouldn't, but the inquiry often turns to whether then you would be an administrator or an exchanger of that token, or whether you'd be better characterized as a user, somebody who's buying it as a principal for your own account. And the real difficulty here is that we kind of have a round peg, square hole situation because FinCEN, the regulator of this area on the federal level, derived these concepts back when it was just Bitcoin on the decentralized side and then things like Liberty Reserve on the centralized side. So when you look in the Ethereum context, it doesn't really fit neatly into these categories. So it's really impossible to eliminate all risk on this front, but you can, it's something discuss with your counsel, you can set up your sale in a way that you can mitigate the risk by looking at what are core issues of regulatory concern in this area, such as money laundering, not being an intermediary that has custody or control of funds, and so forth. I'm going to skip over a few of these and going to, so another area that's often overlooked is derivatives law. If you're just selling a token for money on the spot or ether on the spot, it's unlikely that this will come into play. But if there's any sort of leveraging, financing, margining with respect to your token, or the value of the token is pegged to some other asset, or it can go up or down based on a contingent, say, commercial or financial event, then you would definitely want to look into whether derivatives laws may come into play. The CFTC is active in this space, and it's something that you wouldn't want to accidentally trip over. And then even if the token is not a regulated financial instrument, isn't security or derivative, or falls under money transmitter law, we're not in a law-free zone. It's still, if it's a sale of a product or a service, it gives you utility in the platform protocol, it is still subject to federal and state consumer protection laws. And the really important takeaway here is that when you're doing your terms of sale and you say, this token will give you X, you need to deliver X. Because if the theory is that it's a product or a service, I mean, this is a bit of a crude analogy, but when you order something on Amazon and they say it's going to come in 2 weeks, then it doesn't come. Amazon doesn't get to argue that, well, you took the risk that I was never going to deliver you the product that you bought. So it's very important to follow through on that, and it really underscores the importance of making sure you have a viable use case before the sale, that everything works, and I know people are very, you guys are the technical experts, make sure everything is really airtight and will work before the sale. And in this regard, it's important to recall, I mean, they're in the Kickstarter context where people were saying, bring in money and we'll develop a widget and send it to you later. The state attorneys general have brought multiple cases against people who never delivered the widget. So even in the pure product and service utility context, these residual laws still apply and underscore the importance of clear follow-through. And as a note here, this is just, again, a survey of laws that might apply. This is not exhaustive. You certainly want to look at tax law. It really would vary based on the jurisdiction you're in. And then also things like whether there could be secondary liability based on the sort of participants who are likely to use your platform. So to wrap up with some key takeaways, a lot of these I've touched on, but just to kind of sum them up, it's really critical to have a compelling, viable, non-investment use case when you're developing your tokens in your platform. And as I mentioned in the securities discussion, to the extent that this can be driven by crypto-economic design, where there is a built-in incentive for people to hold and use your token for exactly what you said it was going to be used for, all the better. And when designing your mechanism, it's good to look from the perspective of a purchaser, because that's what, for example, the securities laws would look at whether the purchaser bought with an expectation of profit. So put yourself in their shoes and say, why would I be buying this token? Again, the terms of sale will be the first place people would look, a regulator or someone who is unhappy with what they got. And so being very clear about what you get and what you don't get and what the risks are is very important. And then finally, making sure that the marketing and the description of what you're doing is clear across all of your public and private communications. Thank you again for your time, and enjoy the rest of the day at this conference.
Thank you, Josh.